There is a word that politicians love. Economists love it. Central bankers use it like a warm blanket they wrap around the cold mathematics of their decisions. The word is stimulus. Say it out loud. Stimulus. It sounds almost medical, almost generous. As if the economy, this vast pulsing organism, has simply grown tired, and the responsible adults in the room have stepped forward with a gentle injection. A little boost. A corrective nudge. Nothing to worry about. They're stimulating things. Now ask yourself a different question. Who is being stimulated? With whose resources? At what cost? To whose benefit? And who decided that the economy needed stimulating in the first place? And what gives them the authority to make that call? The word offers you none of that. The word closes the door before the questions can form. And that is precisely what it was designed to do. Language does this. Language has always done this. But we rarely notice it happening to us in real time, because the most effective ideological capture doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a warning label. It arrives in the vocabulary. It settles into the grammar. It becomes, over time, the very structure through which we are capable of thinking, and the walls beyond which we find ourselves, mysteriously, unable to go. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is something considerably more interesting than that. It is one of the oldest and most documented dynamics in the history of human civilization, the relationship between language and power. And it is operating on you right now. Every time you read a financial headline, every time you listen to a Federal Reserve press conference, every time you nod along to an economic debate on television and feel, vaguely, that something is off but cannot locate quite where. Today, we're going to locate it. George Orwell understood this problem with unusual precision, and he wrote about it with unusual courage at a moment in history when the stakes of getting it wrong were not abstract. Most people know him for 1984 and Animal Farm, but the essay that concerns us today is quieter and more surgical than either of those. It's called Politics and the English Language, published in 1946. And in it, Orwell makes an argument that should be read as a warning for every generation that follows. His thesis, stated plainly, is this: political language is designed not to communicate thought, but to defend the indefensible, and to do so by making it impossible to think clearly about what is actually happening. He writes that political speech is largely the defense of the indefensible, and that the defense requires euphemism, vagueness, sheer cloudy abstractions, language that creates the impression of meaning while carefully evacuating the actual content. He was writing about the political vocabulary of his era, the words used to sanitize imperialism, to launder totalitarianism, to make the mass displacement of people sound like administrative procedure. But his framework was not limited to politics in the narrow sense. It was a theory about how language becomes a weapon of the powerful, and how it works most effectively when it becomes so ambient, so normal, so deeply embedded in ordinary usage, that the people speaking it have no idea they're wielding someone else's weapon. The key insight, the one that should stop you cold, is that this isn't primarily about deception in the ordinary sense. It's not about lying. Liars know the truth and choose to say something different. What Orwell is describing is more corrosive than lying. He's describing a process by which language colonizes thought, a process by which the available vocabulary actually shapes what can be conceived. You don't think a thought and then find dishonest words to express it. You think in words. And if the words you have been given are structured around a particular set of assumptions, you will find that certain thoughts are simply very difficult to think. They won't quite form. They'll feel vague, or radical, or naive. They will feel, crucially, like the kinds of thoughts that serious people don't take seriously. That sensation, that feeling of intellectual embarrassment before a thought has even fully arrived, is not a sign that the thought is wrong. It is a sign that the language around you was built by someone with an interest in that thought not being thought. Now, let us apply this framework to the domain of money. When economists talk about monetary policy, they do not speak in the language of choices, trade-offs, and interests. They speak in the language of mechanics, of management, of neutral, technical expertise deployed in the service of abstract aggregate goods. The vocabulary they use is the vocabulary of engineering, of systems being calibrated, pressures being balanced, dials being turned by careful and disinterested hands. Consider the words themselves. Quantitative easing. Not creating money, not expanding the supply of currency, not diluting existing holders to fund new credit. Quantitative easing. The word easing is doing extraordinary work in that phrase. Easing, like a tension being released, like a burden being lifted. Easing suggests relief. It suggests kindness. It is a word that makes you feel better before you have any idea what is being done. Or consider liquidity. When markets freeze and panic spreads and asset prices collapse, the official diagnosis is almost always a liquidity problem. There is insufficient liquidity in the system. The solution? Inject liquidity. Provide liquidity. Restore liquidity. The word conjures water, a life-giving, neutral substance, flowing or failing to flow. A liquidity crisis sounds like a drought. You wouldn't blame anyone for a drought. The solution is obviously to bring more water. What other approach could there be? But liquidity is not water. Liquidity is purchasing power. It is a claim on real goods and services. When you inject liquidity into a system, you are directing newly created claims toward particular parties who are, almost universally, large financial institutions, major banks, primary dealers in government debt. You are making a political choice about who receives newly created purchasing power at precisely the moment when that purchasing power is most valuable. That is not a hydrological event. That is a redistribution. And calling it a liquidity injection does not make it neutral. It makes it invisible. Accommodation. The Federal Reserve conducts what it calls accommodative monetary policy. Accommodative. The word belongs in a hotel. It suggests graciousness, flexibility, a host meeting the needs of a guest. An accommodative policy is a policy that accommodates. Accommodates whom? Under what terms? By what right? The word refuses to let these questions through. It just smiles at you from behind the reception desk. Growth. This one is perhaps the most consequential of all, because it is so universal that it has ceased to function as a description and instead operates as a moral category. Economic growth is good. Lack of growth is bad. Negative growth, itself a remarkable phrase, managing to mean shrinkage without saying so, is alarming, a crisis, a failure of governance requiring urgent intervention. But growth of what? Measured how? Benefiting whom? At what time horizon? GDP is a number that counts every dollar spent in an economy, including dollars spent treating preventable illness, cleaning up industrial disasters, building prisons, running the machinery of financial speculation. It does not distinguish between production that builds real wealth and activity that merely recirculates claims on existing wealth while concentrating it upward. When you optimize a civilization for a number that cannot make that distinction, you are not pursuing prosperity. You are pursuing the appearance of prosperity, and the appearance benefits those who control the definition. This is the architecture of Fiat language, and it is not an accident. There is a philosopher who belongs in this conversation who rarely appears in economics discussions, which is itself revealing. His name is Antonio Gramsci, and he wrote most of his important work from inside a fascist prison in Italy in the 1930s, which gives his ideas about cultural power a particular weight. Gramsci developed the concept of cultural hegemony, the idea that ruling classes maintain their power not primarily through direct force or even through economic control, but through the naturalization of their worldview, through making their assumptions feel like common sense, through embedding their interests in the very categories through which everyone, including the oppressed, understands reality. He made a distinction that matters enormously here, the distinction between domination and hegemony. Domination is what power looks like when it is failing. It requires visible coercion, explicit force, direct command. But hegemony is what power looks like when it is succeeding. When it is succeeding, no force is necessary, because the population has internalized the logic of the existing order as simply the logic of how things are. The assumptions of those in power become, in a very literal sense, the assumptions through which everyone thinks, including, especially, those who are most harmed by those assumptions. Gramsci's insight is devastating, because it means that the most complete form of domination is invisible. it doesn't look like a boot on a neck. It looks like common sense. It looks like a reasonable person shrugging and saying, well, what alternative is there? You have to have some institution managing the money supply. That's just how economies work. That shrug. That resignation dressed as sophistication. That is hegemony operating at its most complete. Now apply Gramsci to the monetary domain. What would it mean for a monetary system to achieve genuine cultural hegemony? It would mean exactly what we have been describing. It would mean that the vocabulary in which monetary reality is discussed was generated from within the assumptions of that system. It would mean that the words available to criticize the system were already compromised, already tilted toward making the system seem natural, inevitable, technical, neutral. It would mean that the most rigorous critics of the system found themselves repeatedly forced to use the system's own language, and in doing so found themselves arguing within a frame that had already conceded the most important points. This is where Bitcoin enters, and it enters not as a financial instrument, and not as a technology, and not as an investment vehicle. It enters as a linguistic event. That may sound strange, but consider what Bitcoin actually does at the level of vocabulary. It does not attempt to reform the existing language of money. It does not propose better management, more responsible accommodation, more equitable liquidity distribution. It does not argue that the dial turners should be more careful, or more accountable, or more representative of ordinary people's interests. It does not ask to speak at the Federal Reserve press conference. It introduces an entirely new set of words, and those words carry, embedded within them, an entirely different set of assumptions about what money is, where it comes from, who controls it, and what it is for. Proof of work, difficult adjustment, the halving, immutable ledger, self-custody, hard cap, time chain. These words do not translate into the fiat framework. They are not refinements of fiat concepts. They are ruptures. They describe a reality that the fiat vocabulary has no apparatus to process, and that absence is not incidental. It is the whole point. When someone who has spent their career inside mainstream economics first encounters Bitcoin, one of the most common reactions is a kind of conceptual vertigo. The vocabulary doesn't land. The concepts don't map. They will reach for their existing frameworks. It's like a commodity, it's like a currency, it's like a security, and none of them will quite fit. And they will interpret that failure of fit as a flaw in Bitcoin. But what they are actually experiencing is the sensation of encountering a genuinely new epistemic territory. Their conceptual map, their language, was drawn for a different world. And it cannot represent this one accurately. This is not a small thing. This is, philosophically, one of the most significant things that has happened in the domain of money in living memory. Because language is not decoration, it is structure. When you have new words, genuinely new words, words that did not exist as concepts before, you have the possibility of new thoughts. And new thoughts about the nature of money, about the relationship between monetary systems and human freedom, are precisely what 2 generations of fiat hegemony have made nearly impossible to think. Let us be concrete about what the new lexicon actually does. Take the concept of proof of work. There is no fiat analog to this concept. In the fiat world, money is created by institutional decision. A committee meets. A vote is taken. Numbers change in a database. The connection between the creation of money and the expenditure of real-world energy, of actual, irreversible, physical effort, is severed by design. This is not a bug. It is the mechanism. Fiat money derives its value not from anything that was done to produce it, but from the institutional authority that issued it and the legal structures that enforce its use. The question, what did it cost to make this, is, in the fiat framework, almost incoherent. The honest answer is, essentially nothing. And the entire architecture of fiat hegemonic language exists, in part, to make that answer difficult to arrive at. Proof of work reintroduces the question with mathematical force. It makes the connection between energy expenditure and monetary creation not merely visible, but structurally necessary. You cannot issue a Bitcoin without having done the work. There is no committee. There is no accommodative policy. There is no liquidity injection. There is thermodynamics. there is entropy. There is the irreversible expenditure of energy in the real physical world. When you hold that concept in your mind, when you actually understand what proof of work means, it becomes extremely difficult to return to the Fiat vocabulary without hearing it differently. The word stimulus will start to carry a new weight. You will hear what it is concealing, because you will now have a word for what it is concealing. Or consider self-custody. In the Fiat world, this concept barely exists. Your money is held by an institution. That is the default. That is the assumption built into every product, every service, every legal framework, every piece of financial regulation. The question of whether you should directly, personally, cryptographically control your own monetary savings is not a question that Fiat language generates naturally. The closest it comes is financial independence, which is something entirely different. A quantitative condition about having enough assets to stop working, not a qualitative condition about whether those assets can be seized, frozen, diluted, or redirected without your consent. Self-custody names something that Fiat language had no name for, because Fiat language was built by and for institutions that require your dependence. It names the condition of genuine monetary sovereignty, of holding in your own hands a store of value that no institution can reach without your participation. That concept, once named, cannot be unnamed. Once you understand what self-custody means and why it matters, you will never hear the phrase, "Your money is safe with us," quite the same way again. You will hear it as a claim made by a party with an interest in your believing it. You will notice, perhaps for the first time, that it has always been a claim, and that you simply had no vocabulary for questioning it. The deeper philosophical point here, and I want to sit with this for a moment, because I think it is the center of everything this episode has been moving toward, is that the capture of monetary language is not merely an intellectual problem. It is a political problem. It is a civilizational problem. Because the ability to think clearly about money is not a specialized academic capacity. It is the prerequisite for understanding how power actually operates in the modern world. We live in a civilization in which monetary policy is one of the primary mechanisms through which wealth is created, distributed, concentrated, and transferred. The decisions made in central banks affect the price of every asset, the purchasing power of every wage, the viability of every business, the affordability of every home, the trajectory of every life. These are not technical decisions. They are political decisions of the most fundamental kind, decisions about who gets what, and when, and at whose expense. And they are made in language specifically structured to make them seem technical rather than political, neutral rather than interested, inevitable rather than chosen. Gramsci said that every relationship of hegemony is an educational relationship. The dominant class does not merely impose its interests, it teaches its worldview. It makes its assumptions the curriculum. And the most complete form of that curriculum is not the one taught in schools, but the one built into ordinary language. The one you absorb without ever choosing to, simply by participating in the culture, reading the news, watching the debates, learning to talk about money the way educated people talk about money. Bitcoin is an intervention in that curriculum. Not through argument alone, though argument matters, but through the creation of a parallel vocabulary that, once learned, restructures the questions you are able to ask. It is, in this sense, genuinely counter-hegemonic, not in the shallow political sense of that phrase, but in the deep philosophical sense. It is building the conceptual infrastructure for a different relationship to money, and therefore for a different relationship to the institutions that have made money their instrument of power. This does not happen quickly. Hegemony is not dismantled in a news cycle, or even in a generation. Gramsci understood this better than almost anyone. He wrote from prison, in broken health, under fascist censorship, with no expectation that he would live to see the ideas he was developing bear any fruit. He understood that the work of building counter-hegemonic culture was long, difficult, and structural, that it required not just better arguments, but better concepts, better vocabulary, better ways of seeing that could, over time, become common sense for a new generation. That is what is being built. Not in the noise of markets, not in the short-term drama of price movements, not in the quarterly performance of any asset class, but in the slow, structural work of a new monetary language finding its way into the minds of people who will carry it, use it, extend it, and eventually find that they can no longer look at the old language without seeing what it was always hiding. This is the work. Not price, not charts, not this cycle versus the last. The work is epistemological. The work is learning to hear fiat language for what it is, a framework built by those with power to make their power seem natural, and finding, in the vocabulary that Bitcoin forces into existence, the conceptual tools to think outside of it, to ask the questions that the old language would not form, to imagine, concretely and seriously, a different relationship between human beings and the money they use to coordinate their lives, their labor, and their futures. Orwell told us to distrust a language that makes the indefensible sound reasonable. Gramsci told us that the deepest chains are the ones we mistake for common sense. And Bitcoin, whatever else it is the first monetary technology in modern history that requires you to learn a new language to understand it, and that in learning that language gives you back the capacity to see the old one clearly. That is not a price argument. That is a civilization argument. This is not a channel about price. It is a channel about civilization. If that is the conversation you want to be part of, subscribe. We are just getting started.